Hi, my name's Kat, and in this episode, Reddit has been asked, what's your favourite creepy campfire story? Gosh, let's see if I can recall it correctly. There was a body of a fairly large person once found in the woods. They were quickly killed, and there was nothing extremely off about the scene, except he had half of his pointer, ring, and pinky finger all missing from his left hand. No one could find the missing fingers, and they never found any clues. A few weeks later, another body was found. Another man who was a bit smaller than the previous guy. Same situation, quickly killed and 3 fingers missing, all from the left hand. And still no clues. A few more weeks went by, and this time it was a woman who was found. Smaller than the second guy found, same fingers missing from the same hand. This went on for a while, with the victims getting smaller and smaller, until it was a kid's body being found. One teenager's body, though, only had the ring finger and pinky finger removed. The police found a fingerprint at this crime scene, and they found it matched the prints from a theft record from the previous victim. The guy telling the story then told the kids that the killer was searching to replace his fingers, and so far he had yet to see if the fingers of the children their age would fit. He then took off his glove, showing he had a scarred pointer finger, and was missing half his ring and pinky finger, and then lunged at the kids while screaming. He later told the kids he lost the 2 in a work accident, and doctors were able to save his very mangled pointer finger. He told this story every year at camp. I worked as a camp counsellor for a few summers, and had a great signature ghost story. I don't really remember too many of the details, but the gist was, there was some ghost who would kill you unless you gave him 2 of your teeth, and told him 2 other names of people to kill. It was a fine story, but the real kicker came at the very end of the night, when all my baby teeth had been replaced with adult teeth. 2 of them never came in and were missing. For a few years I had a retainer with 2 fake teeth to fill the gaps. Before sending the kids off to bed, I would pop the retainer out in secret and give them a big old toothy smile. Scare the absolutely bejesus out the little buggers every time. There was a Brit who was driving through Ireland as the weather got progressively worse and day soon turned to night. He suddenly realised that he was on the wrong road, but there was nowhere to turn around, so he pressed on, barely able to see the road through the rain. Without warning, his car just died. No battery, no engine. He assumed water must have shortened or something. He'd best start walking. He was soaking wet in 100 yards, but he continued walking. An hour later, he heard a noise behind him and turned to see a car coming very slowly up the road behind him, its lights very dim. As it reaches him, he reaches out through the torrential rain and opens the back door and jumps in. Shocked, he is the only person in the car. There's no one driving and there's no other passengers. He freezes with fear as the car slowly continues up the road through the pouring rain. Before long, a village comes into view and the car creeps silently and slowly into the village. The Brit spies a pub, so he jumps out and runs inside, not looking back. Panting with horror, he orders a beer and sits down. A minute later, 2 soaking wet Irishmen come into the pub. The taller one points at the Brit and says, "That's him, Paddy. That's the weasel I saw jump out the car whilst we were pushing." My family had one called the Man in the Corn, or Beans in the Corn. There was once a hobo who was stealing ears of corn from a local man's garden. Now, food was hard to come by, and someone stealing that which you were growing was especially frustrating. The man saw the hobo in the garden and fired a shotgun shot over the hobo's head. The next day, the hobo was back there again, stealing ears of corn. The man decided he would teach the hobo a lesson, so he poured all the lead shot out of his shotgun shells and filled them with small, dry beans. The very next day, the hobo was back in the cornfield again, and the man fired twice on the hobo. And the hobo screamed and ran down the corn rows, fast, pleading the whole way. The man watched for days, but the hobo was never seen again. Some days later, the man still had bean shells in his shotgun, so he aimed at a plank of wood standing over by his well. The plank ripped to pieces. When the next planting seasons came, the father walked his cornfield to its far corners to cut corn husks and prepare to plough. Along the way, he found tiny bean plants coming up through the soil, one here, another there, all lining up to lead him to a big bunch of beans coming up along the edge of the field. When he went to examine the bunch of beans, he first saw shoe soles turned to one side, and then the outline of a body, sank in the mud and soil. He realised he had killed the hobo, and the random beans that had fallen out of his body had sprouted along the way. My father had bought that particular farm during war years and said, for 20 years, random bean plants would show up in that field. Any bean plant that showed up in our garden was given the chance to grow. And one year there was a bean planted that wrapped round a cornstalk. My father did not harvest the corn ears on that plant. So a story I always tell around a campfire that I think is quite spooky is the legend of El Silborn, the whistling ghost. It's a Venezuelan folk tale, but I have a tradition of telling it. Anyway, the legend that goes on cold, dark nights in remote places, especially in South America, a whistle can be heard coming down the road. At first it will seem loud, like it's right next to you, but as the time passes it begins to fade and gets more and more quiet until it's almost gone. The trick is El Silborn's whistle gets louder as he's further away. And when he's right next to you, the whistle is very faint and sounds like it's far away. Once El Silborn is at your doorstep, he will sit down and begin to count the skulls of his victims, and you have to listen to him count every single skull, or one of your family members will soon die after and become one of his. Once El Silborn is at your doorstep, he will sit down and begin to count the skulls of his victims, and you have to listen to him count every single skull, or one of your family members will die soon after and become one of his skulls. El Silborn is said to dress like a farmer with a large straw hat, torn clothes, ghostly aura, and a pale dead face. It's not that scary, but it's interesting. I lived in this house as a child that was rumoured to have a family murdered there. I was around 10 at the time. We used to see stuff here and there, someone running past our peripheral, etc. I even thought I saw a little girl at the end of the hallway once, but did a double take and she was gone. Well, one week I kept having those falling dreams where you wake up right before you hit the ground, always waking up in a cold sweat. This last night this happened, I didn't immediately open my eyes, but instead heard a high-pitched cackle like a witch. When I finally came to, my blanket was hovering slightly above me, and in the corner of my closet is the little girl smiling at me. I pulled the covers over my head and eventually cried myself back to sleep. The best part of all this is we tried to tell my dad numerous of times what we all witnessed in that house, but he never bought it. When we eventually moved, he had the power turned off a few days before we were actually set to be out. And on the last night, as he was leaving, grabbing the last box, he said he heard a voice that sounded like his mother's calling his name from the back of the house. He ran. My grandmother was still alive at that time, so it definitely wasn't her or her ghost. He told me this years later, and said at first he thought he was hearing one of our dogs, before realising they were all gone. It's pretty simple, and I will not drag it out, so here it goes. One day my neighbour walked over into my backyard whilst I was in my garden. He looked dishevelled and was wearing pyjamas. When I stood up, I noticed his eyes were sunken in and it looked like he had lost a lot of weight. I tried to crack a joke about how this would be a great day to go down to the beach if it were not for the weather being so cold. But the joke fell flat. A week later, I bumped into his wife at the post office. She was in line in front of me, mailing about a dozen packages. I asked her if her husband was feeling better because he looked a bit under the weather last week when he was in my backyard. She tells me I must have been mistaken. He passed away over a month ago from cancer. The packages she was mailing were his action figure toy collection she sold online. I was speechless. Was I crazy? Maybe did I misjudge the weekend I thought I saw him? Then I really thought hard. I did not remember him saying anything to me. I did remember telling him the joke and it falling flat. I assumed I wasn't funny and that he didn't laugh. Or maybe he couldn't because it may have just been his spirit. When I returned home from the post office, I immediately started telling my wife about our neighbour. Before I could get out that he had passed away from cancer, she says, "Oh, yeah, I saw you guys talking last weekend." And then I tell her about seeing his wife at the post office and being told about his passing. So we go to our security camera and play back the video from the week before. It's clear in the video that I do stand up. It's obvious I'm acknowledging the presence of someone and have a brief conversation. And then I go back to tending my garden. But on the video, the entire time, I was the only person in my backyard. I absolutely love listening to ghost stories and like scary, spooky stuff. Like I like watching it as well on Netflix. And there's a lot more to go through. So I'm going to stop here and say this is part 1. If you'd like a part 2, comment down below and let me know, and I will definitely record a part 2. And if you've got any creepy campfire stories, comment down below again and let us know. Thanks, guys. This video is sponsored by me. Sweet Mouthful Mixes brings pick and mix sweets straight to your door. Choose up to 10 scoops of your favourite sweets, or pick a pre-packed bag. Sweet Muffin Mixes has a 5-star hygiene rating and full PPE is worn whilst making the bags. With over 50 sweets to choose from, you're guaranteed to find something you like. Treat yourself, you've earned it. Get 20% off with code REDDIT.